Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. This is going to be episode 6 of the Blender 2.78 PBR viewport kinds of techniques that we've been working on here. And in this episode, we're going to look at the idea of subsurface scattering. Now, first I want to just say that it essentially is impossible to do create a subsurface scattering material in the viewport that is authentic. What we have to do is a little bit more hacky here than some of the other things that we've been doing, although all of this has been pretty hacky up to this point. What we're going to do is we're going to try to create some masks that will give us some of the elements that we find in subsurface scattering to just kind of generate a sense of verisimilitude, a sense of realism in generating the effect, even though it won't be really accurate. This is going to depart a little bit from the intentions of some of the other tutorials up to this point, in that we're not really using our environment maps to generate what we're going to do. We're going to be focusing on the light source, the OpenGL light source that we have placed into our scene in order to fulfill this effect. Without an OpenGL light in the scene, at least one, we would not really be able to do what we're going to do here, at least not in a terribly effective way. I suppose you could use the diffuse texture to create a map that would generate a similar kind of effect, but I think that the masks that you would have to create and the amount of tweaking you would have to do on those masks would be so complicated and detailed that you probably would be very, very hard pressed to find a good result. So you're going to need to have an OpenGL light. Now, before we start this, I just want to point out that I have covered this before, and other people have covered this idea before in terms of generating subsurface scattering inside of the Blender viewport or the GLSL shading mode or the game engine. On my YouTube channel, I have a couple of tutorials. I have this one here, Blender 2.7 OpenGL subsurface lighting test tutorial, where I go over a number of the concepts that I'm going to talk about today. This is a little bit different. There is one particular problem with the materials that I talk about in this tutorial that in the tutorial today don't really work, and we have to find a way to get around that. So there's limited application. If you go back and watch this one, this was published back in 2014, almost 2 years ago to the day here. That's one. The other one is this one, which is published just a couple days after that other one, where I give you an application of those techniques. There's this candle element that I generated that is in a 3D tracked scene, and even though this was done a while ago, the results are pretty good. I think they still kind of hold up, but you can see I have this candle here, and there's a light generated here from a flickering wick inside, and you can see the effects of that subsurface scattering. So this is very closely related. So if you go watch these two tutorials, they're not terribly long. This one's only 15 minutes. The other one is just 12 minutes long, pretty quick. Kind of gives you a run through of the basic idea of what we're doing here. So let's take a look at what's going on. Just a quick review. We've generated a number of node groups in here, and I'm going to be using those. I'm not going to talk about how to create those node groups. You need to go look at the other tutorials in this series. First of all, I have an incoming color, which is kind of a fleshy tone. I did a fleshy tone on purpose because when we think of subsurface scattering, we tend to think about skin more frequently than anything else, probably. Although you can do this to generate kind of a waxy look if you're making a candle or some other kind of translucent, moderately opaque kind of texture where light would bounce around inside of it and then be reflected out, giving you the internal color. But anyway, we're going to go with kind of a fleshy tone, and I have that coming into my diffuse lighting node. And just so you can see what these look like through the steps, The diffuse lighting node looks like this. This is what we generated. And I would have my screen space ambient occlusion on if I was just using that. Then that output, you can see that the environment lighting is being applied to it. However, there is no shadow, at least from the main light source, the OpenGL light source that's in there generating the mask. Which brings us to this node group, which is the shadow mask group we talked about in one of the early tutorials, and that would look like this. So this has the mask applied to it that generates that far side shadow coming from the OpenGL light. And then I also have it going through a specularity node group, which we talked about how to create that in one of the previous tutorials. So that, if we put that on the chain, this is what we get. I put a very kind of soft specularity on it, give it kind of that waxy look. It's important that we have that because we're going to need to nullify some of these effects when we do the subsurface scattering. When light is being emitted, light that is being refracted and bounced around inside of the material and then is being emitted, we wouldn't see specularity. We also wouldn't see ambient occlusion. So that's going to present a problem for us. Right now we have on the screen space ambient occlusion. Screen space ambient occlusion is an overlay that you see in the viewport. It's a final composited effect that is placed over top of the scene based on the geometry in the scene. So this is not going to be usable. In order to have ambient occlusion that we can have in the places where we don't see refraction of light, and then not have it in a place where we do see refraction of light, we're going to need to use another method. So I'm going to turn off the ambient occlusion here for a moment and just show you what this looks like then coming through the final node setup. So this is our subsurface node group here, and you'll notice that there's two inputs. There's the diffuse input, which is this chain that I just described, the diffuse lighting, the shadow mask, and the specularity goes in the top. This is the final output. And there's also another input which is called the subcolor in. So this is the subsurface color, the color of what the material would be under the surface. And that is this color over here, which is just kind of an orangey, very bright orangey color, kind of like the interior of you know, an organ or just underneath the skin. Okay, and the effect is a little exaggerated here for the purposes of this tutorial, but you could certainly tone this down if you wanted to. So there's two inputs. There is the chain of the diffuse and specularity and shadow nodes coming into the top, and then the subsurface color in. This is the final output. Let's jump into this node group and see what's going on. At first glance, this looks fairly complicated, but I just want to show you that there are actually about 3 or 4 things going on. There's a couple of subtrees in our larger tree here, a couple of branches that fork out. In general, we have our 2 inputs coming in here. The diffuse is in the top and the subsurface color is in the bottom. The diffuse color is going to go over to a node group over here, into a mix node, and it's going to be mixed with a black color. So the first thing that we're going to do is I need to add to this ambient occlusion effect, because we can't use the screen space ambient occlusion. We're going to have to create it some other way. So the output of that looks like this, and then I'll explain to you what it is. So you can see we have ambient occlusion going on here. It looks just like it would if we had the screen space ambient occlusion turned on, or pretty close to it. And what's going on here is that I have a mask in the factor of this mix node that's mixing a black color on top of that diffuse color. And you see over here what I'm using is merely just a geometry node with a vertex color out going into this RGB curve, where I'm setting a contrast curve on it to give me a mask that looks like this. And I'll show you how we get that vertex layer here in a moment. So you can see the blacks represent the shadow and the light represents the places where we would not find shadow. Now the actual direct output is a little bit more, it's not quite so subtle. It's It's considerably darker. So I'm using the curve to kind of choke back those shadows back into the crevices. Okay. Now what this is this is a vertex paint layer. There's a few ways to create an ambient occlusion pass. One is that you could bake it. And we're not going to talk about that, but you could bake a texture that is UV mapped to your object. And usually if you're using a model that's been downloaded or created by somebody else, or if you've made one, usually you would make an ambient occlusion pass. Or that would be baked directly into the textures themselves, into the material. So you could do that. That is somewhat resource heavy, system resource heavy, because you usually need to have very high resolution images to get a good pass for ambient occlusion. Or you could bake it to the vertex, down to the vertex layer. Okay, so you could make a vertex paint layer. You do that by going to your object and over here to the this little tab here, and it gives you kind of the geometric maps to your object. You can create a new UV map here. You can also create a new vertex color. So we're just using the default one that's in there. And you can bake a ambient occlusion pass to that. If you just set your bake output to ambient occlusion and then click here bake to vertex color, you'd want to check normalized and then bake it. That doesn't always turn out quite so clean. It depends on how many subdivisions are in your model. The more geometry that's there, the better it looks. So you could do that. That's not what I did though. Or you could do the third thing, which is what I did. There is a kind of a default little trick setting that is in Blender. If you go to the vertex paint mode, and if I put it on solid, you can see it. Actually, not quite so well. If we go to the texture one, because it's coming through, you'll see it. If we go to vertex paint, you come over here to the paint tab, and we click on that, you'll see that there's an option for dirty vertex colors. Now, what it does is it will take the places in your model where the geometry is coming into a more acute angle. So where the geometry comes together at an apex of vertices, and it will paint a dark color to that. It'll paint black to it. So if you click that one time, it'll do it one time. If you click it again, it'll add another layer of that and darken it down. So I clicked this 3 or 4 times, and I got to an image that looked kind of like this, which really gave me the contrast to work with, where I could get a pretty clean detailed shadow in there on the crevices. Now it's not perfect. It depends on how well your geometry is put together. You notice on Suzanne there's actually multiple objects that make up Suzanne. So you see we don't really get the vertex paint in here around the eyes, so there's a bit of a discrepancy there. This was just kind of a quick and dirty way. Now if I turn on ambient occlusion, I would actually see that in there if I use my screen space, but again we can't use it. So I created this dirty vertex layer, and let me send this back to object mode here real quick. And then that goes into a curve adjustment to choke down the whites and get, or rather choke down the blacks and get a tighter matte. And then I apply my black color with the mix node, and we end up looking like this. So I have ambient occlusion. So you need to do this because when we apply the subsurface scattering effect, 2 things need to disappear. The specularity needs to disappear in the places where there is light being emitted from the object, and also the ambient occlusion needs to disappear, because where there would be light being emitted, there really can't be shadow. So we can't really have that shadow overlaying from the screen space ambient occlusion that is in the viewport. Okay, that's a real bummer, I know, because if you have a bunch of different objects in your scene, and only one of them has this kind of material on it, you can't just really turn on the screen space ambient occlusion and render it, unless you rendered perhaps a pass of just screen space ambient occlusion without that object, or as a placeholder in there or something. I don't know how you would do that, but you need to have a pass that excludes that object in terms of the ambient occlusion. Or the other way is that you would need to apply ambient occlusion passes to all of your objects, which might be a little tedious. So this isn't perfect, but this is what you have to do in order to pull this effect off. Okay, so that's the first thing. We add the ambient occlusion. The second thing, excuse me, that we're going to do, excuse me, I have a cough here. We're going to take this output and bring this diffuse output with ambient occlusion into another mix node. Now I'm going to mix into that another a pass that is made up of this. I have a mix node down here with my diffuse output, and then on the bottom I have my subsurface color in. And you see I have this set down to 0.25. So you could play around with this to get, you know, whatever kind of look you want. But what it's doing is it's just mixing a little bit of the glow with that diffuse output. So you get kind of this, you know, reddish looking glowing version of that same diffuse. So it still has some, the specularity in it. It still has some of the shadow in it, although it's more red. And I get this kind of a look. And I'm going to use this as part of my kind of environment ambient occlusion parts, where a little bit of light from the environment lighting, that one OpenGL masked light, is coming in and bouncing around, and gives me just a very subtle effect. Okay, so I've got a diffuse output, and then I've got this mixed output, and I bring both of these up to another mix node where I put the diffuse on the bottom and I put this glow on the top. And then above that I have another mask that I have set up. Now this is a little bit more complicated. I have here a material called Subsurface mask. I'll show you what that looks like. This is a somewhat of a complex material. It is a shaded material. It's going to be another light mask material. One second here. If I go to this material in our setup here, you'll see that it's got a very interesting kind of appearance to it. It's white where the light is hitting the object. It's white where there is absolute shadow on the object. But kind of in between where the light is directly striking the object and the shadow, there's this gray kind of look. And what I did is I created another a light mask here, just like my shadow mask. But on this, I applied a ramp, a color ramp. And on the shadow side of it, I have white, where it would be black. It is absolute white. And where the light on the diffuse is, it would be, it is white, as it would be. And then in the middle, I have this kind of off-white gray color. And I moved it into position so that you get a little bit of a fall off. So the effect here is that where my light is hitting direct, I see white. And then where the light starts to fall off a little bit, I start to see this gray. And then where there's shadow, I get absolute white. Now this is going to be a mask. So we're going to mask on to our object, our material, the diffuse lighting, the absolute diffuse lighting wherever you see absolute white. And where you see the light gray, ever so slightly, we will mask in our subsurface scattering material. Now here's the idea. When you're looking at an object that has this property to it, where you see the light hitting it, you'll see the outside illuminated, the absolute exterior. You won't see a lot of bouncing around. But as you get towards the fall off, that's where you will start to see the light kind of refracting around and then being sent back out and causing a little bit of emission. So for example, if I put my hand kind of up towards the sun, around the very outside edges I would see a little bit of a reddish color. That would be the subsurface scattering effect of that light, and that's kind of what we're emulating here a little bit. Okay, now it's not geometrically perfect, it's just the best that we can do. This doesn't really line up exactly where it would be. It's just it just really isn't a good way to map a perfect rendition of that. So we're just gonna make this acceptable for right now. Okay, let's see how we map this in. If we go back up to our node group, here's my output, and that output is coming down to a mix node into the bottom, and I'm mixing on top of that a white color. Now what I'm doing is I'm using my Fresnel material from earlier that I used in previous tutorials, and I'm going to use this as a factor to kind of mask out some of that. So on the very outside edges, you'll see here how this is working. We'll see a little bit more white. So we won't see this effect quite so starkly all the way around. We'll see it just kind of in the middle here. I'll show you what this looks like. So here's the output after applying that Fresnel effect. I'm sorry, I meant to say we'll see it on the outside in the Fresnel area, but we won't see it right in the middle. Okay, so as we're staring at the object dead on, we'll see less of that refraction of light. We'll see it more on the outside edges. So it'll only show up whenever those parts come into the Fresnel area, the oblique kind of perspective, okay, which is a little bit more authentic yet. So it's adding one more detail. So we don't always see the subsurface scattering. We only see it at particular angles. Okay, so you can see how this is going to work. Now this mask is going to be applied into this node over here, which is a subtract node. And what I'm doing with this one is I'm going to subtract a Fresnel effect off of here. Now on this one, I placed a color ramp on my Fresnel effect. And let me show you what it's doing here. What this is going to do is it's kind of inverted, or rather not inverted, but it is crunched down quite a bit. So the white that would be on the outside is clamped, and it's also turned to kind of a dark gray. And this is going to be applied on top of my other mask that I just showed you as an overlay. It's going to subtract, rather, is what it's going to do. So it's going to take out some of that white on the outside edge. So here's the overall effect that we're going to get. I'll show you what we're after here. Two kinds of subsurface scattering that we're noticing in here. We are noticing the kind that is from the light source around the edges, but we're also getting kind of all the way around ever so subtly on the outside edge. We're going to get a little bit of a Fresnel subsurface scattering anywhere you look at it, because there is light coming from all directions. There is reflection inside of the scene. There is not merely just light coming from the light source itself, and that would be also more true to life. So there will be a very, very ever so slight Fresnel effect where we see some of our subsurface scattering. So very, very complex. The complexity is in the mask generation. It's not really in the material itself. It's in the way that we're going to create masks to allow certain colors to come through. So you have to go back through, get a good picture of this. You might need to pause and kind of sort this out in your mind and understand the logic a little bit. But this is what we're after. It's still a little bit different from the other tutorials that I mentioned. This is a little bit different from those. And it will be a lot different here as we go forward, and you'll see why. Okay, so this is now a mask. This mask is going to come down to this mix node. What you see here is a mask. So the light is going to be one material and the gray is going to be another material. The white will be the diffuse material and the gray will be that diffuse glow mix. Okay, so we have these two materials that we're working with. Here's the diffuse with our ambient occlusion pass on it. This is the scattered combination here of the diffuse with the glow, and then we have the mask applied to it, and we get this. This is our output. So you can see that right here at the edge where the light fall off is at, on the Fresnel edge, we can see that glow, and we can also see very, very slightly all the way around the edge, no matter what perspective, we see a very little bit of a glow in there. Okay, and on that glow, the specularity is diminished, and the ambient occlusion is also slightly diminished. All right, so this is the bulk of the effect right here. Now, I want to show you something. If in my scene I turn on another light that I have a point light right in the middle of Suzanne here. It's a very powerful point light. And it's a very small one. It has a very quick fall off. But if I turn this on, you'll see what happens. Oh, nothing. I'll show you why, because I don't have it set up right. Let's jump back in here real quick. Let me get the final output and you'll see what we're talking about. Now if I turn my point light on, you can see that Suzanne is glowing from the inside. And I can actually move my light around, and you can see that Suzanne will glow wherever I move my light. And actually I think I want to change my colors a little bit on the outside. I don't like this color. Make it a little bit more orangey. A little bit lighter too. Try that. Okay, so you can see that Suzanne is glowing. If I move my point light back and forth, Suzanne will glow. The ambient occlusion will disappear wherever she is glowing, and the specularity will disappear. So it's a pretty realistic looking kind of glow going on here. Now let me show you what's going on. You can really see it here in the shadow. Actually, this is probably the best place to see it. So as I move, it's not easy to see from the sunlight side of it, but as I move the point light over, you can see how Suzanne really does look like she's glowing from the inside out. We can see that underlying color that is behind the surface on Suzanne. So let's see how this is put together. Jump back into our node group. We have to apply another mask, but before I look at that mask, let me show you what the other materials are going to be. We need to have this absolute glowing material. It's not exactly the same as the mixed one that we created over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the output from our subsurface color in, and we're going to bring that all the way out here to another mix node. We're going to drop that in on top. And then underneath, I have also the output from my glow mix down here with my diffuse color. So it's that glow mix that I had earlier, and I'm bringing that into the bottom. Okay, so I have the glow mix and I have the absolute glow. We're going to use the glow mix from earlier as the dark version, and we're going to use the absolute glow as the light version. We're going to create a little bit of a Fresnel effect here. So we'll use our Fresnel texture one more time, and I put a color curve on this. It really clamps it down, and you can see what that output looks like. Looks like this, so it's really tight. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a mask. To mask in on the light color, we're going to mask in the diffuse mix version of the glow. And then where you see the black, that's going to be the absolute glow. Okay, so if I put this in as the factor, I have my diffuse mix in, I have my absolute glow in, I get an output that looks like this. So this is my interior material, the glow material. Now the reason why we want to apply this Fresnel effect is because where you would be looking at the object at the oblique angles on these edges, the tissue would be much thicker. There'd be thicker tissue there, and because you're looking at an angle, you'd be more likely to see some specularity and some outside influence on it. So we want to be able to get that effect so we can still kind of see the definition of our object as we turn up the glowing light. Ultimately, though, it will all disappear if the light is bright enough in particular places. So if we bring the point light right out to the edge, even that will start to disappear. You can see portions here where that's happening. Okay, so this is our absolute glow material. The other material that we had here a moment ago was the diffuse with the subtle ambient atmosphere light kind of subsurface scattering. So these two materials are going to be mixed together, and we need to apply another mask to do it. So we're going to generate a mask that is especially for high-powered lights. Okay, and this is going to be made up of another material. We're going to call it Subsurface Glow Mask. It's this one right here. Now this material, like on my other tutorials, is made up of a Fresnel material. Now we have a problem though, in that inside of the setup that we're using here, where we're using a sun lamp for the shadow mask, Fresnel materials in the viewport do not respond quite properly to sun lamps. There is a very drastic fall off, a cutoff in the shadow part, whereas with point lights, the point lights in the Fresnel material in the GLSL viewport shading, point lights will penetrate into the Fresnel material, and wherever the light falls off, that's where the color will dissipate. So we have to use this because of the point light, but it doesn't work right because of the sun lamp. So we have to find a way to deal with the sun lamp. Let me show you what I'm referring to here very quickly. Just quickly look at the settings. It's kind of a grayish color, intensity up to 1. We're not using specularity. Okay, so this is it. It's just a kind of a gray low color, which means it's going to have a very high powered light to get it white. And then the intensity is all the way up, and it's a Fresnel material. Let's take a look at what the problems are here. So we'll tab back into our node group. If we look at this output with the sun lamp alone, let me turn off my point light briefly here. It will look like this. So this is what the mask looks like with a sun lamp. So you see what I'm talking about. We have this really nasty looking cutoff here. Now there's a way to deal with that. What we can do is we'll put in another instance of the same material, but on this one I'm going to click on invert normal. So what it will do is it will give me essentially the exact opposite of what I see here. We will see an image that looks as if the sun lamp is casting light on the very interior and then shadow on the exterior. So it looks like this. This is what the inverted instance of the material looks like. And you see that that fall off follows on that line almost perfectly, if not perfectly. So where we see black starting on the first one and where we see the opposite side black starting on the second is in exactly the same place. So what I decided is that we could probably take both of these and just throw them into a mix node at a factor of 0.5, and they should cancel each other out. And we'll see what we get here. We should be able to get rid of that black line. So this is what we get, kind of a darker gray, and there are a few discrepancies in there, but you'll notice that that harsh edge is fairly well dealt with. It's not perfect, but it is gone. Okay. Now ultimately what we want this to look like is we want it to look black. We want this to be a very, very touchy kind of mask, such that it requires a very high-powered light in order to trigger it. So I placed on this a color curve adjustment, and I made a contrast curve on it, and that looks like this. This is where it's going to start to look like the other tutorials. So it's essentially fairly black. There's a little bit of lightness in there. You kind of have to tweak this until you get it in the right spot. But it's a fairly black mask, so this wouldn't really affect much. You might add a little bit of our secondary color, but not very much. Now if I turn on my point light, you'll see what happens. My point light illuminates both the positive and the negative side of it perfectly, so that if I move the light, let me grab the light here, the light on the outside will penetrate in, and it will also penetrate out. So it's just as if I had just a regular Fresnel material and only a point light in the scene. And there is a little bit of a discrepancy here around that sun lamp seam, but it's not a very noticeable one. So this is the way to get around the sun lamp problem and still be able to use the point light. Okay, so you can see the trick we're playing here. A little complicated, it's very hacky, but it's what we got to do. So I have the positive version, I have the negative version. They're mixed together at 0.5 to cancel each other out. Put on a color adjustment curve so that we get it down to essentially black where the high-powered light is not affecting it. And then we can add a high-powered point light. It's at a high level. I think it's at a 5 or a 10. And then we can use that to mask very harsh lights in the scene that might cause our material to glow, such as would be the case with a candle and a burning wick. Okay, this is how you would accomplish that. Now the output of this mask is going into this mix node down here. So I have on the top this material, which is the diffuse material with our subtle subsurface scattering effect on it, and that Fresnel effect and the edge of the light effect over here. Okay, and then underneath that I have my glow material that has the light and dark versions applied that I spoke about a little bit earlier. So these two are going to be mixed together using this mask up here, this Fresnel material mask, and ultimately I end up with this output. Okay, so wherever I have my point light, it will glow, and wherever I don't, it will go back to the diffuse. And you can get some very believable kinds of effects by doing this. So all of that to say that it can be done. Now, I don't know that you really want to do it, but it can be done. And this is not really using any of the PBR effects really that we were talking about. I'm just showing you that you can find a way to apply this trick inside of the PBR environment in such a way that you can use these kinds of materials if you need to. So if you're making one element for a scene like that candle and you want to light it just right with the environment colors and the shadows and then still be able to have this kind of glowing effect, you can do it. It's possible. So hopefully you find this useful, and I hope you at least are encouraged that you can do this. You can make this node group and set it aside and save it, and if you ever need it, you can use it. Then you'll have it. Okay, so that's the diffuse texture there, and this is what it looks like as a subsurface scattered material. So you can see the difference. It's not it is quite a bit different. In fact, if I turn off this point light, probably important that I show you those two again real quick. So this is the subsurface scatter material. Get a point here where you can see kind of the edge of the shadow. This is what it would be without that applied. So you're missing that subsurface glow without it. So that's with it, and that's without it. Now let me turn off that ambient occlusion there. So this is without it. Turn off the ambient occlusion. This is with it because we have an ambient occlusion in there. So there you go. Subsurface scattering. In the future tutorials, we're going to spend our time looking at how we can import pre-made materials that are already textured and painted and applied by UV mapping from pre-existing models that you may have already created or models that you have downloaded, and applying our environment mapped textures to that in order to generate environment lighting and effects. So we're going to composite together some of these node groups that we've already made. And that's what we're going to look at going forward. So with that in mind, looking into the future, I wish you the best of luck with this technique, and all of you, I wish happy blending.